So it's Friday morning. I'm going into the office, into Neat's office. We're going to be leading a workshop on belonging at Neat work. There's this idea called Conway's Law that says essentially that the shape of the inside of your organization dictates the products that you create. Neat is building something that is designed to help people at enterprise companies, at global big companies, big, like biggest companies in the world, thrive. And that really can't happen, we believe, unless the people within Neat work are thrilled themselves. Neat's grown from 3 people to 10 just in the course of the last 3 months. And so we're gonna be sitting down with the crew and talking about what it means to create a culture of belonging, what it means to create a thriving organization inside so that we can help the organizations that we serve outside thrive as well. Stay tuned. One thing that's changed my culture, one thing that's had a huge impact on my group is a check-in round. And so think of it like a stand-up, and oftentimes people will do a check-in round as a part of the stand-up, but it's a way to build a sense of camaraderie at work, right? We all care about each other, but we're also heads down in the weeds of like customer development, the code base, whatever it is, the new person who's coming in and getting them set up, right? All of the day-to-day minutia that we forget to pause, or maybe we don't have the space to pause in our day and say, hey, how are you? You're a human I care for. How are you doing today, right? And so it's called a check-in round, and it's really just one thing you're grateful for today. We can talk about maybe, and I would even suggest including it in daily stand-up, but it's just that momentary pause. It takes less than a minute per person, but it's like, I'm grateful that my hotel has a really great breakfast, right? It's the hotel around the corner, and like they made customized omelets for every single person today, and it's awesome. It's like, great, that's the same thing I'd eat at home, and it was so great to not have to be like, oily food and hash browns that look kind of, it's so powerful, right? When we take a moment and just have a momentary connection and say, hey, I see you, or like, oh, I noticed you were crying in the hallways, there's something going on that I can help you with, or you look particularly great today, like you're looking so dapper, right? Like it's just those human connections, and what those connections do, that's what we're trying to build at Neat, right? We're trying to enable the companies, the biggest companies in the world to do that. And speaking from a lot of personal experience, those biggest companies in the world are not very good at supporting their humans at work, right? A friend of mine and a friend of the company, Steve, was saying after 15 or so people, it's really hard for a single individual to keep track of in the entirety of a team. And so building the habits at this stage, right? I've watched Neat go from 2 people to 10 people in less than a year, right? Now that we're coming together, building those habits of like, oh, cool. If that door's open, like default to transparency, does that mean I can come in and sit down? I'm really interested in business strategy and not just code. Or, can I ask a question? Or, oh, it's really quiet in here, right? Does that mean that I shouldn't speak aloud, right? Like establishing those protocols that it's so easy to fall into the ways that we were all trained, the ways we were brought up, the ways we were schooled, the ways other organizations that were maybe more or less functional behaved in the past. We fall into these routines. And so rather than adopt those practices, it's how do we want to do it? There's an opportunity. We're growing an incredible thing here. And there's an opportunity to continue to build that so that 2 years from now, when Neat is substantially bigger, we'll see the DNA of what we do today and what we do this week and what we do this year in that future company. We in this room are responsible for what that looks like. And so it's really stepping into our own and saying, hey, let's be really clear about the culture we want to build. And it doesn't come from on high. It doesn't come, the CEO is like, these are the core principles, the core operating principles of the organization. It's all of us, right? And I know that the leadership team wants it to be that way, but it also requires each of us stand up and say, oh, actually, this is a really interesting thing that my old company did, and if we tweaked it this way, I think it might be really great for us, right? And so this is a forum, and this is just the first step. This isn't a closed thing, right? The goal is to do some version of this ongoingly. And so my undergrad was in research psychology, cognitive and behavioral psych, and there's this 200-year history in psychology studying what's wrong abnormal psychology. It's like, oh, cool, let's look at autism, let's look at schizophrenia, let's look at, depression, let's look at all of these like negatives and downsides in people who are really struggling with a hopeful goal of like, oh cool, let's try and make it a little bit better. But there's this whole other side, and it's come about more in the last 10 or 15 years, called positive psychology, which is, there's nothing wrong, we just want to optimize. And so when I think about, there's obviously in tech particularly a lot of conversation about diversity and inclusion, and in some ways like it's very necessary, right? We look at what's happened with Uber, we look at so many different stories of populations not being heard. But in some ways, my goal is belonging, right? Which to me is not the diversity, there's something wrong, there's something to be fixed, the abnormal psychology version. It's the like, there's nothing wrong. How do we optimize it? How do we make it even better? How do we, as you said, become a shining example of that people look at 5 years from now and say, wow, I wish I could work at a company that had half as cool a culture as me.